This lecture is about auteurship, or auteurism as I call it. So the opening slide sets the scene really, and let's set the scene by turning the lights down low. Oh, it is down low, how unfortunate. We get Kubrick on the left-hand side looking at strips of film, the very epitome of the cinematic auteur. And then on the right-hand side, we have Kubrick at a Christmas party covered with that soft streamer stuff that his grandchildren threw at him. So these sort of contradictions between who a person is and who the myth of a cinematic auteur is part of the basis of the lecture. So anyway, my aims today, to define auteurism. Now, auteurism is a bit of a catch-all phrase. Basically, there are lots of different versions of what is more commonly known as auteur theory. Auteur is French for author. So they include the auteur theory, which is an Andrew Sarris. He invented the term, and he always puts the direct article before it, so whatever, the auteur theory. So then I'm going to explain what I call the 4 phases of auteurism. So I will explain this, but I'll just rehearse it. Aesthetic, semiotic, post-structural, and commercial. I know it probably sounds really exciting. This is basically a categorization I came up with, and hopefully it will make sense during the lecture. Then I'm going to suggest how Kubrick films can be understood from the perspective of auteurism, i.e. as exemplars of a great cinematic auteur and the work thereof. Or perhaps how auteurism can be critiqued from the perspective of Kubrick. So critique, just to mention, so when you criticize something, you're pointing out negative things. When you critique something, you often are trying to uncover sort of hidden assumptions that perhaps even the author isn't aware of. So the work of a film scholar and a critic in certain traditions is to critique, is to sort of bring to the surface these sort of buried meanings. Finally, I want to sketch out some of the history of what is considered to be the historically contingent concept of authorship I've written here. So there's two, in philosophy, if something is necessary, it means it must follow. If something is contingent, it means it may follow. So it doesn't necessarily mean, it ain't necessarily so if it's contingent. All right, so starting off with a, AZ quote, very scholarly. One man writes a novel, one man writes a symphony. It is essential that one man make a film. So this is actually a quotation from Stanley Kubrick, which I sourced. So it belies the AZ quotes. It's got a proper citation in the notes of the PowerPoint. But it really does set the scene, doesn't it? The idea that Kubrick himself bought into auteur concepts of the single great artist forging the cinematic work to represent his point of view and his sensibility. If you look at fan art, what emerges as kind of legendary auteur figure, very much a name above the title. In fact, Kubrick contributed to one of the first sort of popular books on auteurism called The Director as Superstar, which was written around the early 70s. But this is the kind of popular image that you have of him. And actually, I did a chapter on auteurism about Kubrick. And I thought initially when someone sort of offered me the gig, I thought, well, this is going to be a slam dunk. Who doesn't think that Kubrick is a great auteur? What I discovered was paradoxical. As I will point out, the people who were most responsible for the auteur theory didn't rate Kubrick as an auteur. So there you go. Anyway, the dictionary, in last year actually, 2018, the Oxford Dictionary came out with a new adjective, Kubrickian. Meticulous perfectionism, mastery of the technical aspects of filmmaking, and atmospheric visual styles in films across a range of genres. That's the definition. They also had Tarantino-esque and Lynchian and other ones. So what greater homage for a directorial auteur can it be than you have an adjective named after you in the Oxford English Dictionary? But as I said, so Andrew Sarris here is responsible for the auteur theory. In 1968, reviewed 2001. Now it's either top or second usually on most best films of all time list. He said, 2001 A Space Odyssey is a thoroughly uninteresting failure. So you'd agree, it's my favourite film. You bastard. Anyway, okay, moving on. So let's define what I mean by Auteurism. I don't just mean this, I dug into sources as well. A perspective on cinema that unites the diverse collections of writings, La politique des auteurs, and the author theory, to name just two. So in other words, as I say, work on authorship has gone under many names. So you can't just look at auteur theory, say, which is the most common one, because you then plugged into the work of Sarish and you miss all the work of Cahiers du Cinéma and others. So Auteurism, handy kind of catch-all. And now my PowerPoint is frozen. Thanks, Windows. Let's see if that's kicked it back into life. Oh, yes, it has. All right. So auteurist writings share a common assumption that the director of a film is its author, the individual who bears sole responsibility for the film's creation. So that's, if you like, a definition. And it sort of segues quite well into Kubrick's one man makes a film, one man writes a symphony, one man writes a novel, etc., etc. Kind of male bias there. One person writes a symphony. Anyway, this is my attempt to dramatize the death of Hollywood in a very Hollywood style. So history, the significance and the power of this auteur theory is very great. So after the 1950s, the influence of the Hollywood studio system began to wane. Several reasons for this. One is that they lost the distribution monopoly. It was an economic reason. And a new Hollywood emerged from the ashes of the old system that became focused on the figure of the auteur as a director. So, for example, Easy Rider is an example, or Bonnie and Clyde from the 60s. And later, when you get into the 70s, the work of Spielberg, the work of Coppola, the work of George Lucas even. So very much director-led films. Many commentators have linked the rise of the impacts of auteurist theories to this fact, that the new Hollywood system. So I've listed just a few. Baudouin Thompson, Kolker, and this guy called Schatz. Schatz wrote a book called The Genius in the System, which is really the antithesis of the auteur theory. In other words, the thing that says the opposite. The genius of the system critique says that films aren't the work of one person, but in fact are like multiple collaborators all working together. And indeed, the Hollywood system produced films like Casablanca, Wizard of Oz, all of these sort of Gone with the Wind. And that was the genius in the system. So auteurist theories, though, themselves went through different phases since the 1950s. So I've color-coded them for handy identification. We have first what I call aesthetic auteurism, then semiotic auteurism, post-structural auteurism, and then finally commercial auteurism. So just to map dates, 50s, 60s really, aesthetic auteurism, I knew I'd do that. Semiotic auteurism comes in late 60s, 70s. At the same time, post-structural auteurism, which actually denies the very legitimacy of authors, which is interesting. And then finally, from the 1980s, you've got commercial auteurism, which is like director's cut on DVDs or special Blu-rays mentioning directors' names, that sort of thing. So we'll start off anyway with aesthetic auteurism. So this journal here called Cahiers du Cinéma, which, anyone speak French? I don't, which is why I apologize in advance. Cahiers is kind of like a dossier, folder of cinema, okay? This groovy, someone's making groovy. Anyway, French film criticism of the mid-20th century still influences the way we think about film today. Words such as genre, which I know you've encountered because I saw it in one of the lectures, mise en scène, and auteur are part of the lexicon of film studies. Why, you might wonder, do we have so many French terms in film studies? It's probably because of this journal, actually. The writers of Cahiers du Cinéma included François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, and Eric Rohmer, and many of these went on to become notable directors. So in a kind of movement called the Nouvelle Vague, which stands for French New Wave, which happened around the end of the 50s and the 60s. So if you've heard of Bout de Souffle, Godard's Breathless, I don't know, so it's a gangster film, written by François Truffaut, directed by Jean-Luc Godard. Similarly, Truffaut's 400 Blows won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. So they went from film critics to filmmakers of some note. And incidentally, if you've ever seen Close Encounters, the French guy in Close Encounters, that's François Truffaut, just a bit of trivia. Anyway, aesthetic autism, these are the three sort of tenets of the theory from Cahiers. Film could be regarded as a new language of expression. The language can be located primarily within the film's mise en scène. Mise en scène means staging, basically, placed in the frame. So all the elements you see in the film frame and how they're blocked and structured and staged is the mise en scène. And then the director is the one person who is ultimately in control of the mise en scène and therefore should be considered the author of the film. So those are the 1, 2, 3. I go into in some more detail. So film as a language then. In really 1946, this guy, Alexander Astruc, he envisaged a time where the cinematic authors would write using the camera stilo or camera pen. So in other words, just as authors write with a pen, the cinematic authors would write with a camera, and that would imply that cinema is itself a language. This is kind of new in 1948. Don't forget at the time, cinema was considered sort of like video games were 10, 20 years ago, you know, disparaged, lowbrow, part of mass culture. So people trying to elevate the cinema into something more. It was sort of dangerous. It would be like writing about, you know, Snapchat these days as saying it's a, you know, potentially great communication form, something like that. Anyway, mise en scène. So mise en scène then is the syntax, this is a Hiller quote, through which everything on the screen is expressed, the placing of the actors and objects, the movements within the frame, the capturing of a movement or a look, in short, the intellectual operation which has put an initial emotion and a general idea to work. So it, just in the same way that language consists of words which are ordered into sentences which becomes grammar, the cinema, it consists of elements of the mise en scène which are structured in certain ways and produce cinematic language. That's the basic idea of it. And then it's the auteur, auteur, French for author, directors who create films in a cinematic language, which is what elevates their work above the mere métier en scène. Now, métier en scène just means scene setter, sort of journeyman director, job's worth. So there are, in the cinema, there are mere métier en scène, and there are also auteurs. This is the idea of François Truffaut. The task of the critic is to decide who is an auteur and who is a métier en scène. This is where Cahiers du Cinéma's advocacy of la politique des auteurs, or author policy, originated. And this sounds very grand, all those French works, but it's basically like those sort of Facebook posts or internet lists that say, name your top 10, and then people go into real sort of arguments. No, I think this is better, this is better. It's basically that. So you get something like this. Orson Welles, great auteur. John Huston, who's responsible for Maltese Falcon, Treasure of Sierra Nevada, and Asphalt Jungle, among others, mere métier en scène, according to Cahiers du Cinéma. So it's like our survey said, and it's kind of a bit childish, I think, offering my criticism of auteur theory. Anyway, from the French, in the late 50s, well, pretty much the whole of the 50s, this position was developed. Andrew Sarris, who at the time was a very influential New York film critic, writing for the Village Voice, and he wrote in 1962, La politique des auteurs is an idea that reshaped my thinking on the cinema. The idea simply expressed is the director is the author of a film, the person who gives it a distinctive quality. It's interesting nowadays, you think, yeah, isn't that obvious? No, it wasn't obvious in 1962. As I say, the dominant theory was the genius in the system, and cinema wasn't an art form because actually it lacked authorship. So this is why it reshaped his ideas on the cinema. As far as I know, writes Sarris, there's no definition of the auteur theory in the English language by any American or British critic. Therefore, he's going to supply one. So what does he say about it? He conceives of it as 3 circles. The first circle is technical competence. The basic idea here is in order to be an auteur, you've basically got to be a good filmmaker. You've got to know what you're doing. So it's a simple starting block. The second one is a personal style. So when you watch a Tarantino film, usually you can identify certain motifs or elements that are Tarantino-esque, or a David Lynch film, or a Kubrick film. So that's a part of personal style. So in order to qualify as an auteur, you need to have that. Your films can't sort of be cookie cutter. You've got to think, yeah, that's a definite, you know. And then finally, they have to have a unique vision, which is a perspective on the world. The films of an auteur should say something, and say something uniquely about the world. Sarris, in his inimitable fashion, said they must possess a certain élan of the soul, which you think, what? But yeah, that's so unique vision. Anyway, so the question then, what did Cahiers critics and then Saris say about Kubrick? As I say, my presumption, before I actually dug in and researched this and wrote about it, is, well, obviously they would have rated him because Kubrick is considered perhaps, you know, arguably one of the greatest filmmakers ever lived. Some would say the greatest filmmaker who ever lived. So Cahiers critics tended to pigeonhole Kubrick not as a cinematic genius, but as a well-meaning liberal, very much like Stanley Kramer, another SK director, who is, you probably haven't heard of Stanley Kramer, my point. Reviewing The Killing, which is an early Kubrick film, very influential, influenced Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, told out of sequence. Reviewing The Killing in 1958, Jean-Luc Godard called it a film of a good pupil, no more. Kubrick is still far from being the bright boy heralded by the excited publicity surrounding his little gangster film, condescending much. Truffaut was a bit kinder. Paths of Glory today is considered a classic anti-war film, up there in the cinematic pantheon. Truffaut called Paths of Glory a very beautiful from a number of points of view, as well as an important film that establishes the talent and energy of the new American director Stanley Kubrick. All well and good. However, he still identifies weaknesses within the film's structure, complaining particularly about its lack of psychological credibility. So it's an okay review, but considering now Paths of Glory is considered like a classic film, you read the review and go, oh. Finally, we get to Andrew Saris, the auteur theory guy. So Saris acknowledges that Kubrick is hailed in many quarters as the greatest director since D.W. Griffiths, but he admits he does not like his films. And this is interesting. In a review of Barry Lyndon in 1975, he considers this and he addresses the fact that, he's on a bit of a sticky wicket here, not liking Kubrick. So he says, I have been charged by people I respect with having a blind spot with respect to Kubrick's work. And it's true, I literally cannot see or feel him most of the time. He's too odd and eccentric for my taste, and he seems to work far above the surface of his unconscious. His stylization therefore strikes me as a form of emotional evasion. So, yeah. So it's interesting, so he's aware now, post-2001 age, of Kubrick's greatness as a filmmaker, but he says he doesn't like him. So this opens the whole idea, especially of Saris, I think, opens up to certain criticism. So Buscom writes, despite the presentation of the word theory, the critical language used is very subjective. It is then less of a theoretical statement and more of an expression of Saris's own critical beliefs or prejudices. And so consider, what is a theory? Well, let's take an example. Halley, in the 1800s, took Newton's theory of gravitation and predicted the reoccurrence of a comet, now named after him, Halley's Comet, within days, 75 years hence. He said it will repeat every 75 years and land on this date. Now, if you think about that in terms of what came before, in terms of, some kind of medium making a prediction, a clairvoyant, no one gets to be that accurate. Theory is a toolkit for making hypotheses that you can carry forward and work, so that really, if it is a proper author theory, auteur theory, you'd expect it to have criteria that you could identify great filmmakers. But Saris never says it's that. Says it only works retrospectively. In other words, an author has to emerge first, be acknowledged as a great auteur, and then we have to look at why. And you think, that's not a theory. That's just you sort of sounding off, basically. Anyway, so that's aesthetic auteurism, and it's aesthetic because it's talking about feelings and all these sort of things. Semiotic auteurism is another. So the two people most responsible for this are Jeffrey Noel Smith and Peter Wallen. So in an appreciation work of L'Avventura, Noel Smith defines auteurism as follows. He says it requires the critic to recognize one basic fact: authorship should be the organizing principle for an analysis of the director's oeuvre. Now, oeuvre just means body of work, so another French term. But it's an important shift. So semiotic auteurism is no longer looking at the author figure as the primary component of the analysis, looking at the body of work instead. And then the critic's primary concern is to seek out hidden connections between the films, or so-called recondite motifs. So a motif in music is something you hear a little phrase and it sort of sticks. It's an element. Recondite is just a posh word for hidden. So that's the declaration of what semiotic auteurism does. This is then taken up by Peter Wallen in a very good book called Signs and Meanings in the Cinema. He writes, the auteur theory implies an operation of decipherment or decoding. The task of the critic is not only to identify the typical features of the author's oeuvre, but also to map the principles of variation which govern these. So, there are 3 books which are very famous critical books on Kubrick. The first is Cinema of Loneliness, Robert Kolker. Second is Michel Simon's Kubrick, in which he has about 7 interviews with Kubrick and appreciation. And the third is Thomas Allen Nelson's Kubrick, Inside a Film Artist's Maze. Now, they don't state overtly that they are within this tradition, but when you read into them, they're looking for these recondite motifs and they're making connections across his body of work. So if you take that as a definition, these are definitely examples of semiotic auteurism. And most, up until the Kubrick archive came sort of online in the mid-2004, something like that, this was the main Kubrick scholarship, and then it's now shifted to archival studies. But anyway, Kubrick, writes Nelson, has a remarkable ability to convert cinematic form into a variety of meanings which he communicates obliquely so as to avoid pat conclusions and neatly tied up ideas. In other words, he uses recondite motifs. So how does this work? Take your favourite film, 2001. So it starts off, and it's like a what the hell moment. Starts off not in outer space at all, but in prehistory, with a group of hominids surrounding a waterhole and sort of having a battle. Later on, though, it switches, and we're into a kind of Cold War film. And if you note the staging, so around the table, there's a conflict between the Americans and the Russians here. But it's staged in a very similar way. So when you look at the sort of filmic language of the way things are structured, you start to spot these connections. Similarly, in the primordial world, there are all these bleached bones. It's a very mythological sort of mise-en-scène of the humanity is dying sort of thing. And later on, all the spaceships have the similar kind of look. It almost looks like a spine and a cranium in the major spaceship that travels. The thematic point here is that is in prehistory, humanity sort of hovered on oblivion, and then was saved. And in our history, although it seems like it's a great, exciting space travel world, it's the same kind of theme comes through. So that's partly a thumbnail discussion of what recondite motifs might mean, but it goes wider. So, for example, in A Clockwork Orange, there's a character of a tramp who gets beaten up by Alex and his gang. And he says, men on the moon, men spinning round the earth, and no attention paid to earthly law and order anymore. So there you have a direct reference to the events, men on the moon, men spinning around the earth in the space station. And it seems that it's almost like Alex and his droogs are the sort of hominids back on earth, the violent tribes doing everything through violence, whereas up in space it's all lovely. Similarly, if you look at some of the staging of the fight scenes, it almost looks like a lunar landscape, doesn't it? So not only do you have these meanings in the film, but then it sort of invites you to look at Kubrick's entire oeuvre and see these connections. And that's where Kubrick fan scholarship was born, basically, so making lots of connections. Surely he meant this. Let's look at some of the major themes. So there are, in these 4 famous Kubrick films, there's this idea of perfect systems going awry. So in Dr. Strangelove, which is that one there, you have the Doomsday device, which was this supposed to be infallible device to prevent nuclear war, invented by the Russians, and then gets triggered by a rogue general, the actions of a rogue general, and the whole of humanity is destroyed. Going to Clockwork Orange was a film about how you can cure violence through the Ludovico technique of sort of brainwashing, behavioral modification. And Alex is the guinea pig, and then of course Alex gets into terrible problems, tries to commit suicide, and it all goes awry. In 2001, the perfect artificial intelligence machine controlling the mission, incapable of error, sort of has a nervous breakdown, kills all the crew, and goes completely AWOL. And in The Shining, the hotel, can play with Danny forever and ever, the sort of perfect system that's luring everyone in, gets defeated by Danny, this 5 or 7-year-old child. So you've got these sort of thematics go, not just the symmetrical shots and the sort of attention to detail, but thematically as well. So Kolker writes, Kubrick's films have an intellectual complexity that's associated more with literature than with film. But then, interestingly, so although in semiotic auteurism we expect the work to take precedence, nevertheless an image of the author emerges through the work. And Simon writes, the image of Kubrick that emerges from these analyses is one of an emotionally detached director whose preoccupations include games, strategies, and technologies. And you start to get a whiff of the sort of discourse that says Kubrick is a cold, heartless director, etc., etc. And then Kolker sort of adds to this, Kubrick's films are cold and distant. He does not see the possibility of men and women regaining control over themselves. Rather, he shows the diminishment of humanity. So people are starting to make assumptions about the director. And I'm kind of wondering, is that entirely from the work, or are you taking the paratextual elements of Kubrick's public image and also kind of feeding those into your impression? That is a thought I will leave for a bit later. Anyway, so that's semiotic. Then you get into post-structural, which happened around the same time. And it isn't about auteur theory as such, but it's really interesting to include because it's almost like the antithesis, the opposite of auteur theory, because it basically denies the existence of authors. So thinkers such as Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, they're called post-structuralist thinkers. So they represent the antithesis of traditional ideas of auteurism. They deny the validity of authorship and the author in all media, including film. So Barthes famously questioned the whole legitimacy of authorship with his death of the author critique. He argues that the author's voice is lost as soon as something is narrated. The writing, so what he basically says is this idea of authors as being composers, geniuses, originators of language. He says, no, they're not. They're like arrangers. They just take things that are there and they assemble them. And that's not an act of creation, that's an act of assembly. So the death of the author is where you look more at language itself rather than at authorship. He writes, all writing is itself this special voice consisting of several indiscernible voices. The voice of the author loses its origin. The author enters his own death, writing begins. Now, this is all rather polemical because he's deliberately trying to stir things up. But what he's saying is that, if you write something really good and people start praising for it, you start internalizing those values and think, yeah, I did that. But, when in the act of writing, often you're just, flying by the seat of your pants and you're just putting anything down and hope it works. But retrospectively, people read into that and read a personality out of it. And Barthes is really alerting us to the fact that that's problematic. And it's opposing something that goes on in our culture, which is romanticism, this heralding of authors, which I'll get onto in a minute. So some of this is about intertextuality, this language thing. So life is lived through text and framed by text. So in other words, how you are as a person is often from the stuff that you pick up from other sources, mediated sources, not directly. Even language and discourse of what you're told by your parents or friends. How much of it originates with you and how much of it is just out there in culture. Much of what we know about the world is derived from media sources, books, cinema, radio, television, the internet. This intertextuality, so the stuff that just comes and sort of you start to value certain things in your thought, that blurs the boundary between mediated experiences found in text and the world of lived experience. So I want to delve just a quick detour into the history of authorship, because authorship, the way it's conceived in the auteur theory is very interesting. It's just a historically contingent aspect of authorship informed by Romanticism. And I'll explain that. So within the medieval view of the book, writes Sean Burke, the author was the scriptor copying out. So either in those big sort of things in monasteries, just copying out Bible verses. So you don't add anything to that. You're just a dictation machine. You're just copying it out. Or another version of the scripture is something like the Prophet Muhammad or St. John the Divine for Book of Revelation, where divine inspiration strikes and he just writes it all down as if, he's just the vessel of God. So there's no egotistical author there. It's just something like a dictaphone going on. And that was the way the authors were considered up until roughly the start of the 16th century. So, or the 17th in the case of Immanuel Kant. So the philosopher Immanuel Kant located the source of ideas not with God, but with what he called a supersensible realm. So it's almost like semiotic authorship. They're moving away from the intentionality and egotism of a figure and saying it's more the deeds and everything. So Kant identifies what he calls aesthetics as the source of new ideas. So new ideas in everything, actually, in philosophy. Where do we get new ideas from? He says we feel them through aesthetics. Aesthetics in this sense, people might think, aesthetics, that's like the arts, right? But it's the way Kant used it is the opposite of anesthetic. So an anesthetic puts you to sleep and dulls feeling. So therefore, an aesthetic promotes feeling, and that's where you see the source of the ideas. It's majorly influential. This because it starts to be the shift. Why is medievalism with all of this sort of God stuff, monasteries, and then we go into the Enlightenment? Well, this is the Enlightenment philosophy. Romanticism came afterwards. So within the Romantic view, the author is seen as imitating the act of creation itself. The author, they never go as far as saying the author is the creator like a god, but it's sort of implied. And this is the point. So the poet Shelley wrote, "The imagination creates anew the universe after it has been annihilated in our minds by the recurrence of impressions blunted by repetition." Is anyone familiar with the work of the Russian formalists? Have anyone come across that in this module, for instance? Okay, what the Russian formalists said is that the job of art is to defamiliarize. They say in your habits of everyday existence, beauty and everything gets dulled by repression and your habits. You're just not in a mind to notice things. Great works of art take you out of that frame, puts you in a space where you suddenly see the world anew. It's defamiliarized, it's full of life again and vitality. And this is what Shelley was talking about. The annihilated in our minds by the recurrence of impressions blunted by repetition. So romantic authorship then is this whole idea of author as creator, author as a kind of proxy god. And that is very much the unquestioned idea of authorship that persisted until the death of the author with the post-structuralism, where they kind of recovered a lot of these historically contingent ideas of authorship. So just to sum it up, James Joyce, in his book, Portrait of an Artist, he gives this words to a character: "To forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated consciousness of my race." That's basically the sort of manifesto of authorship. So you think of an idea, and it becomes, it goes viral in culture and becomes something that we now all care about. So back to post-structuralists then, after that little detour. So the post-structuralists offered a completely different answer to the question of where ideas come from, but described the emerging from the structure of language itself, which is seen as a chaotic network, a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable senses of culture. In other words, there's no order to it, there's no structure, you just pull things out, and that's what makes a structure, like a arranger of a piece of music or conductor in an orchestra. Foucault also proclaimed the death of the author, but he conceives of authorship not in terms of personality or biography, but as what he calls an author function. So an author function is like, if you talk about Marxism today, then it's not so much associated with Marx, but it's all the ideas that we rope in under that title. That's what an author function is. So it's not actually what Marx intended or wrote, but it's all the ideas that have collected. Similarly, in The Shining, Kubrick and Diane Johnson drew heavily on Freudian theories such as the uncanny when they were writing the script of the film. That's another author function. So the question is, so texts, not vehicles for personal agency, rather kinds of discourse. Discourse just means talk. So the question is, how does that work in a Kubrick film? And the candidate film that I'd like to talk about is AI, Artificial Intelligence, which is a Steven Spielberg film, but he developed it from a script by Kubrick and loads of pre-production ideas by Kubrick as a homage to his late friend. So the Kubrick family, after Kubrick died, you know, the film was heavily in development. Spielberg was involved for a few years, and they said, would you make it? And so Spielberg said, yes, I will make it, as a sort of homage to my late friend. So in terms of authorship, it becomes interesting because, for a start, a tenant, so let's look. So Spielberg can be seen as channeling, therefore, Kubrick's author function. So him homaging or riffing on Kubrickian ideas is precisely how I'd like to conceive of the author function in relation to Kubrick, and how that then gets parodied in a lot of popular culture, actually. So producing something that is stylistically and thematically Kubrickian. So there's also a problem because, you know, one man writes a film, one man writes a symphony. Here, you have two people, two auteurs, both of them auteurs in their own right. And you can start to see the way that the film channels the auteur function, for example, in the staging of the mise en scène. So we have these homages throughout artificial intelligence, and an internet commentator called Candice Drouet pointed them out. So Clockwork Orange at the top, artificial intelligence, Barry Lyndon, artificial intelligence, and 2001 Space Odyssey, artificial intelligence. So these aren't accidentally composed in this way, it's sort of deliberately Kubrickian. And it was also, the release of the film was an opportunity for critics to talk about auteurs, basically. They started to, the film was very much seen through a lens of auteurism. So, for example, Arthur in 2001 called AI the result of an odd coupling of the Prince of Bleak and the Emperor of Ice Cream. And Friedman, 2007, argued the austere and coldly intellectual Kubrick would seem to have little in common with the hyperkinetic and viscerally emotional Spielberg. So what's interesting is a film that actually is deliberately set out to be... One of the things, for example, is people criticize all the bad things, the things they didn't like, you know, that schmaltzy and sentimental is, oh, that was Spielberg just imposing his will. Most of them actually came from Kubrick. So Kubrick, in a sense, is stepping out of his caricature and doing something a lot more emotional, which is why Spielberg got involved with the project in the first place. He said, Steve, I think you should direct this, it's much more your style. So it kind of is interesting, but what's interesting, again, this thing that emerges from semiotic auteurism of the figure of Kubrick, and now it's the figure of Prince of Bleak and cold and intellectual, coldly intellectual, all of these sort of stereotypes we associate. So then we move on to the final phase, which started around the 80s and continues to this day. So, for example, when you get the Russo brothers into Avengers films, you're drawing upon a kind of auteur idea. The Russo brothers, they become, but you know, it's all Kevin Feige. In fact, the producer is the auteur these days. Anyway, so the impact of post-structuralism saw a decline in serious critical attention paid to authorship. Basically, it was a dead dog. It was dead in the water. No one tried to. Everyone was sort of unmasked with this romanticism. You're just, you know, parroting that, and you took it uncritically, but now you look at it and go, oh, yeah, okay, we were a bit like this. So in terms of serious critical attention paid to auteur theories, it sort of died, certainly by the 80s. But it became, it's interesting, it morphed into a primarily commercial concern. Catherine Grant turns this new phase contemporary auteurism. I have redubbed it commercial auteurism just because it seems to be more descriptive of what it is. She defines this as a series of production, marketing, reception, and discursive practices. Discourse again comes from talk. So a discourse is like when a shampoo commercial says, now the science bit, and we know we're into graphs and people in white coats. All of that stuff suggests scientific discourse. So anyway, a discursive practice is underpinned by shared belief in the specific capacity of an individual agent, the director, to marshal and synthesize the elements of filmmaking. Timothy Corrigan, who's a major player in commercial auteurism, links the impact of what I have called aesthetic auteurism to the film's industry demand that cinema should be shrouded in an artistic and specifically romantic aura. In other words, this was commercial imperative. You know, if you can have art films, for instance, and cinema's great art, well, that sells movies, so why not? Let's do it. Corrigan notes, auteur films are often marketed by the director's name appearing above the title. The cult auteur, this is definitely true of Kubrick, the cult auteur therefore functions as a kind of brand name, providing recognition that governs the reception of auteur films as objects of value. Have you seen the new Tarantino? You know, the new Ridley Scott, blah, blah, blah. So Kubrick, interestingly, in terms of commercial savviness, controlled the marketing and distribution of his films. And that strengthened his status as an auteur within the studios. For example, with Clockwork Orange was a $2 million movie in 1971. Warner Brothers thought it would make about $5 million. Kubrick said, can I take over the marketing of this? And they were like, oh, okay. And it turned into like a $40 million hit, the biggest hit for Warner Brothers in 1971. What he did was do things like he invented what was called the box office report. So he got old issues of Variety, put them into a database, and looked at similar films to his and where they had played in certain cinemas and what the box office was, and said, look, this is an adult-orientated film. This plays really well in this cinema. Book it for this cinema. And the head of Warner's, it was all very sort of fractious, said, no, 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 we know best. What are you? And Kubrick had this spectacular success with Clockwork Orange, and the guy got sacked. So, you know, it's very dramatic. But actually, that's why he could write his own checkbooks with his films, because his sort of obsessive control was, you know, made a lot of money for the studio. So he supervised the promotional campaign. Filippo Oliveri claims that Kubrick deliberately created mythology for himself as a powerful cine auteur. How many people have seen Making The Shining? Yeah? Nodding? Oh, don't. Okay. Well, you'll know in there he's kind of horrible. Everyone says he's so horrible to Shelley Duvall. What's interesting is that the editor of Making The Shining said that Kubrick had final cut on that film and took out all the scenes where he was nice and conciliatory and just promoted all the scenes where he was really horrible. So there was something deliberate in the way that he chose to present himself in that film, which is interesting. And this is another example. He personally thanked Victor Davis, Daily Express journalist, who wrote that he'd ordered all of the fields near his studio home to be sprayed with DDT because he couldn't stand flies. So again, it gives the impression of some, what? You know, there's a famous story, he didn't drive more than 30 miles an hour in a car and wore a crash helmet. That's another kind of Kubrick film. And what it seems from the archive studies is a lot of the times these myths were sort of, you know, passed out. So the question is, why would you make yourself seem so horrible? The simple answer is because it sells your films. So thanks to a well-crafted mythology, a director can become a household name. So for instance, if you look at Alfred Hitchcock, fashioned himself as morbidly ironic, jovial man. Federico Fellini was just a liar, invented outrageous stories about himself. And Lars von Trier, in the modern sense, you know, is banned from Cannes and does all of these stunts. And that gets a lot of news coverage. And then people go, oh, von Trier, he's such an enfant terrible. I must go and see his film. So Philippe Oliveri writes here, I believe Kubrick successfully created a mythological image for himself that helped him to be perceived as a powerful, distinct director, basically an auteur, and quirky, always interesting personality, endlessly able to attract media coverage. So yeah, this is all a ruse. Being a nice guy, you know, it's lovely, but it doesn't make people want to see your films. If you think, oh my God, he's such a tyrant, oh, but I'd like to see what he's done. You know, it's a commercial imperative again. Right, so I'm just going to finish with something that's the flavour of Kubrick the Auteur.
It was magnificent.
One of his pictures are equivalent to 10 of somebody else's.
Oh, no, Carl. And shake his head.
Do you know him? And nobody ever really knew him.
He was known as a kind of future threat.
One of the all-time great motion picture makers.
A future threat to peace and quiet.
Legendary. Meanness.
There were times he drove me crazy.
He was a very lovable
individual.
I love him one minute, and the next minute I hate him. I could kill him.
Perhaps the most intelligent person I've ever met.
He got fascinated with Nescafe commercials
Have you seen the film Groundhog Day?
because they told stories so fast.
Well, that's what it was like.
This man was born to push the envelope,
There is still a part of Stanley that's a great mystery to me.
and he always pushed the envelope.
And you must expect someone like that to be different from the rest of us.
I think we were too scared of him over here.
Everybody pretty much acknowledges he's the man, and I still feel that underrates him.
Okay. And finally, so as Church remarks, Kubrick continues to carry more currency in death than any of his contemporaries. And that's true. Just look at the amount of memes that you get inspired by his films. Right, so summary then, that's it. Auteurism is a perspective on cinema that says that a film director is the person most responsible for the quality and meaningfulness of a film. Auteurism had a huge impact, the rise of New Hollywood in the 60s and 70s, for example. The four phases of auteurism that I have outlined are aesthetic from the 1950s to the 60s, semiotic 60s, 70s, post-structural 70s really in the English-speaking world, commercial 1980s until today. These phases also trace the evolution of the concept of authorship in critical thought, i.e. it started out being sort of a romantic thing that wasn't questioned, later on it became disparaged by the post-structuralists. It is a paradox that Kubrick was not considered to be an auteur by the major proponents of auteur theory. This can be seen as a criticism of the subjectivity of auteurist claims, i.e. it's not much of a theory. The notion of authorship itself has evolved throughout history. The dominant notion that informed auteurism in film criticism was romanticism. The validity claims of romantic notions of genius and creativity were effectively refuted by the post-structuralists. And today, the influence of auteurism is stronger than ever, but as a marketing tool. Okay, that's it. Thanks so much for your attention and for your spirited performance earlier on in the session. I'm very grateful.